I am really excited to turn it over to my friend and colleague Natasha Holmes, who is from Cornell University, and I just have realized I don't have any introduction for you because I forgot to look it up. So that's okay. You can
tell a funny story.
Introduce yourself. Well, we met because you sent me a cold. This is why you should send cold emails. So we met because you sent me an email, and you had some questions about epistemic agents and things, and so I had the privilege of serving on advisory boards for some of your NSF grants back when we could have those projects.
We still do.
We still have them. But I always enjoy our conversations, and I will say that I think of the world of physics education things, you have the privilege of hearing from someone who's on the cutting edge of thinking about things and interesting methodological things. So thanks for being here, and let's welcome Natasha.
Okay, so thank you all so much for being here. I'm excited to get into some of my thoughts and feelings about AI in science education and in science education research, getting into that methodological piece. My research historically has been in physics lab instruction, so most of what I focus on is students' experiences and learning. I should have checked. You can hear me through the mic? Yeah, okay. Sorry. Student thinking and their learning and experiences in the context of hands-on undergraduate physics lab instruction. So we've been early stuff looking at sort of understanding the limitations of traditional labs. Why are they so bad? Because so many people have complained about them for so many years. What is it that's actually at the root of that? And then studying how to do better, particularly using labs towards teaching critical thinking and scientific practices and epistemology and attitudes and all kinds of stuff in that space. And now moving a little bit into sort of supporting faculty lab instructor development to adopt and take on innovative, non-traditional lab courses. And so now I'm tasked with talking to you about AI. And so you may be sort of thinking, like, who is this person who's done physics lab instruction, who's now here to talk to us about AI? Actually, I'm going to jump to my disclaimer first, which is that that's a very valid concern, and I fundamentally don't think I have any idea what I'm talking about. On the one hand, I think that this world is changing so quickly that none of us really know what we're talking about, and we're all kind of trying to find our footing here. I do have a wonderful group of incredible colleagues that I work with who really do know what they're talking about. So most of what I know about AI, I have learned from these collaborators of mine, folks both at Cornell, to grad students that we worked with, Rebecca Fussell and Megan Flynn, Alex Worth, who's an engineering education researcher, and then Anil Damle in computer science, and then some physics education colleagues in Europe as well that have really shaped my thinking about things. So what we've really been working at is thinking about sort of how to integrate AI both into our teaching practices, but then also into our research methods. And so I wanted to sort of take this 1,000-foot view, and I found this beautiful image of Salt Lake City to represent that, and sort of the messaging and everything that sort of I think about with AI in this space is that we shouldn't be trying to fight it. We really need to be trying to figure out how to work with it because it is here and students are using it. And so understanding what works and what doesn't. And as much as possible, I think our critical thinking skills are paramount. And this is where my prior research really does come in to use that sort of lens of how it's affecting both our students and our research. And then a theme that is going to constantly come up, and it's come up many times in conversation today, is when using Gen AI, all of our concerns about it, we have to constantly be asking ourselves, are these unique to Gen AI, or are these concerns that we should actually have been having about the way we were doing things before? And this will come up again and again throughout today. So I'm going to talk, this is going to be sort of split into two pieces. We're going to talk about the ways I've been thinking about Gen AI for teaching in science education, and then separately this sort of methodological piece. You should feel free to interact with questions at any time. I've been in all of the different kinds of seminars, different environments, so I'm used to whichever you want to do. But please do feel free to interrupt and ask questions anytime. Okay, here we go. So the first one, talking about Gen AI for science education. The first sort of example, I'm going to start with just sort of a few musings and ramblings about the things that we've been thinking about. The first one is about the ways that it can potentially, we'll call it remove extraneous cognitive load. That is just buzzword for really removing busy work, I think, from students' tasks. And this is sort of a natural experiment that emerged in a second-year physics lab course that I've been teaching where it's a semester-long course. The students get into groups, they design an experimental physics project, they have to write a proposal, it gets peer-reviewed, all of this stuff. And I taught it in the fall of 2022, and then I went on sabbatical and came back and taught it in the fall of 2024. And if you remember what happened in between those 2 dates, is that ChatGPT all of a sudden emerged as this opportunity in this platform. And so the very hilarious natural experiment that I'm going to show you, this is not a data-based thing, this is just an interesting observation. The figures that the students produced as part of this project course in these 2 years, in their final report and their final presentations, this is an example of what they were doing in 2022. So we have these students working in Google Colab, doing some rudimentary Python coding, and they make, if you've ever coded in Python, you will recognize this as like the default formatting that comes out of the base packages in Python. And they're doing some fairly rudimentary graphing, and it like allows them to do the thing that they want, but it's certainly not fancy by any means. Here's another example that gets a little bit closer to fanciness. They're doing some funky fitting that's going on in here, but there's a bunch of sort of issues with the level of the graphs, and I think, well, we'll get there. In 2024, though, the flavor changes dramatically, and this is the kinds of stuff that all of a sudden is coming out. I'm not doing any pedagogical intervention here. I'm not developing any instructional materials. This is just what they were finally able to produce, I assume because they had ChatGPT at their disposal. And on the one hand, just the data that they are representing is more complicated. They get into this, visual is kind of broken down here, but this is an incredible heat map of some data that they've created. And then this one I find is a beautiful example up in this top corner, where like the thing that they represent is very simple, but they did little things, like they made the dots bigger, and they added the error bars, the little caps on them, and these are things that like you have to tweak in the Python code to make that happen, and the students in 22 just like were not doing that, right? Like look at those ones. And so these little things getting into that aesthetic piece and being able to represent data a little bit more complicated. And this is another one where the students did this crazy set of harmonic oscillator experiments, and you can see that one of the things that they're doing is like fitting lines not to the full data set, but just like selecting a subset of data pieces to try to do these comparisons. And in this case, they wanted to understand this linear regime out there. So this is like a lot of weird pictures. Let me explain the point that I think I am making, is that this, for the students to be able to have ChatGPT at their disposal for doing this data analysis, it really removed a lot of the busy work, right? Again, this extraneous cognitive load. They weren't spending a whole bunch of time Googling code about how to format graphs. In theory, they can spend their time interpreting the graphs and making more sense of more complex data representations. And for my purposes in this lab course, our learning goals were about interpreting data, right? And making sense of data and measurements. And so when my goals were about communicating and interpreting data, it really helps to sort of remove that busy work and get them their analysis much more quickly. Of course, if your learning goal is about teaching students how to program in Python, this is not going to help them, and we'll talk about that piece separately. But in this case, it felt very advantageous for students' experiences. Now, there are, of course, a lot of caveats to that. And the first is that the students obviously now need to think much more critically about what it is outputting. The whole system becomes even more black box than it was before, and so we have to make sure that they are taking the time to stop and think. And thinking to themselves about, in these moments when I can use this to create shortcuts for myself, when is it okay to take that shortcut, and when isn't it, and how do you make those judgments? And this is, again, where I think concerns about AI also apply to the status quo. And so when I was going up through undergrad, we would be Googling these answers, right, to how to code things, and we were still getting that copy-paste and like getting the information from somewhere else. And so the question is sort of, how different is this from what was happening before? Unclear. Okay. The second example, now sort of getting more into this critical thinking space, as we start thinking about, right, the need now is to make sure that the students really are stopping to think about the quality of the output that's coming out. In the first year physics lab course that I taught most recently, just this past semester, I had inherited a version of the course from someone previously who had designed this lovely activity to get students to learn how to read and summarize a scientific paper. And as I suggested this, in my TA prep meeting that we were going to run this as the next homework assignment, one of my TAs immediately is like, please don't make me grade that again. Last year, it was very clearly just all a bunch of generated, ChatGPT generated responses. Please don't make me do that again. So we quickly pulled the assignment and generated a new one that was effectively, let's have ChatGPT or GenAI read and summarize the paper for you, and your job is to evaluate if it did a good job of doing that. So here's the prompt that I gave. I used Microsoft Copilot just because we have an institutional license for it. So I told the students I've given 2 research articles to Microsoft Copilot and asked it to summarize them and answer a few questions. Here's the prompt that I gave Copilot, and this is effectively the exact same homework prompt that the instructor before me had given to the students, which I now just gave almost unedited to ChatGPT. So summarize the article, what is the motivation, what is the evidence, and then what are the future directions for the research. So then your task, again back to the students, is to choose one of the 2 articles, reflect on the chatbot's response. Are the chatbot's responses accurate, provide evidence? How would you improve the chatbot's responses? And what concerns do you have about using chatbots to summarize technical papers and research literature? And so the goal here now is, how do I, given that we know that students are going to access this, we can assume that many students are going to access this, I want them to be thinking about how do I integrate this into my scientific workflow, and what are the guardrails that I should be putting on, whether to trust it or not. So just to give a sample response, this is, I chose, okay, so full disclosure, the response that I'm going to show you, I went to the grade book, sorted by score, and took the person with the highest grade. So full disclosure, this is completely cherry-picked so that you see what is possible. So this student went through and said, yep, responses were mostly accurate. However, the summary is at a surface level, although the content may be accurate. And then they went on to give a whole bunch of examples about what was surface level and what was maybe misrepresented in the article. How would you improve the chatbot's responses? I would do it by engineering a prompt that matches my goal. When developing this improvised prompt, I will clarify motivation and research questions, ... They then went on to provide an improved ChatGPT prompt, GenAI prompt, that they think would be better. And here's what it looked like. So now they said we should tell it to read the assigned research article carefully. Your analysis should not only showcase understanding, but also critical analysis and engagement with the main purpose of the study, its designs, and the findings from the paper. Use clear and complete sentences. Support your points with evidence directly derived from the article, not from sources outside of the article. Include a summary, and then a whole bunch of information. And then insert some key things to look out for in this category in bullet points. May vary depending on the paper and the purpose, blah, 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 blah. And then they went through with all of the things. So then on the last question, what concerns do you have about using chatbots to summarize technical papers and research literature? They can easily have lack of precision, they tend to generalize, they superficially understand the information, failure to convey proper information, and they're also known to have this tendency of agreeing with the user. So this to me tells me that this student, the first example, right, they provided examples of where the chatbot was superficial and all of that stuff. So they had clearly engaged with the readings in order to do this evaluation, as well as had this lovely reflection on sort of this meta-level reflection about using it integrated into their workflow. So assuming that students will use generative AI, then our job is going to be to help them learn how to use it responsibly and constructively within the context of our learning goals. And as much as possible, I think, so on the one hand, I think that there should be general education courses about generative AI and all of the moral, ethical, environmental implications of using it. We also have a job within our scientific fields to help students figure out how it integrates into our workflow, into our practices, all of that stuff. And then a very small thing that I noticed is I had this moment at first where I said, well, I'll get the students all to feed the paper into ChatGPT themselves and then evaluate the output. And then this environmental flag switch for me was like, wait, do I really need 450 students to send the exact same prompt and paper into ChatGPT? That feels unnecessary. And what if I have a student who does not want to use generative AI for whatever reasons? Oh, maybe I could just run it once and give them the output. And so that's what I ended up doing. Now, hopefully someone in this audience has a very important critical thinking question, which is, can't the students just feed the new assignment into the chatbot? Yes. Yes, they can. And there are many ways to handle this. In this moment, I needed to create an assignment very quickly and put it into my syllabus. And so I made the choice that that is fine. And I assumed that if the student did this, they would feel just a little bit icky about it. And that was a great learning objective, learning goal. So if you have ideas about other ways to do this, we've had a couple discussions today about other ways to structure this. But hopefully this gives you inspiration and maybe some. Okay. And then the third one, which is going to start to head us into sort of more of our research program, is about using generative AI to support student reflection. And this is work that I really have to give credit, particularly to Alex Worth, who again is an engineering education researcher at Cornell, who's really been instrumental in this process. And it's been really fun to work with her on this. And then Michelle Smith, who's a biology education researcher with us as well. And so we know that reflection is incredibly important in all kinds of educational contexts, both in the teacher ed space and science ed, all kinds of places. You know, getting students to reflect on various experiences is incredibly fruitful. But I'm sure many of you have had situations where you ask students, for example, describe a challenge that you faced working with your team this week. What did you or your team do to overcome this challenge? And students will just say things like, we didn't have any challenges, or everything went fine. It's like, you did not reflect in the ways that I wanted you to reflect. And so how would you possibly improve these reflections in this, you know, especially in large science courses? So what typically has happened is that we've had this sort of set of predefined questions that the instructor develops, sends them out to the students, and then we get these sometimes vague, sometimes very deep and beautiful reflective comments, but kind of everything in between. What we really want is a one-on-one interaction with the students, right, where we get to talk to them, where an instructor who understands the role of reflection in learning is going to have a conversation that is personalized with the student about their experience and about what they've, about their experience, and the students give us engaged responses back, and then we ask another question, et cetera, et cetera. And so obviously this is a talk about AI, so you know exactly where I'm going. We've been trying to understand is this something that a chatbot could do for us at scale? So could you have an instructor give a large language model a prompt that is, I want you to have a conversation with my students about teamwork or critical thinking or their teaching experience or whatever it may be, and ask them personalized questions such that they respond to you, you pick up on what they just said, and send them a personalized response question back, and get them to really reflect productively, and then somehow feed all of that back to the instructor. And so what Alex and her team did was come up with a sort of engineered prompt to try to bring in both what we know about, you know, best practices through education research, the particular course context and learning objectives, and the orchestration of how this thing is actually, how the conversation should flow. For example, saying, cut it off after 4 questions, we don't need the student spending 2 hours on this, like it should be short, et cetera, and putting sort of guardrails on the process. So this is the detail, this is the prompt that eventually got created to do this, and you don't need to read it. The point is to say that you do have to really construct and engineer the prompt, and this is now actually outdated, and Alex thinks that there's even better ways to do it, and she learned that if you put in capital letters, then it really doesn't ignore it. I don't know why that matters, but anyway, we continue to play there. So for example, so we ran, this is an example of a set of reflection questions that we did about teamwork. So again, sort of the standard static reflection prompts were, what are 3 ways you worked well together during last week's lab session? What problems do you have, or what problems did you have interacting and working as a group? And what could you do better next week to interact as a group more effectively? And just an example of like, these static questions are not always back, right? And so this is a very beautiful, deep reflection that a student did. We were very successful in separation of tasks. Everyone had a job. They were responsible for, they worked very efficiently. We could have integrated our work together well, or we did integrate our work together well. We parallelized the work. There were very few conflicts, et cetera, et cetera. So what problems did we have? Mostly it was just technical things. They don't like our Google Colab notebooks and time pressures. And then what could you do better? Maybe if we planned out our experiment in advance, we could work with everything more quickly. Lovely. These same set of prompts also elicited these sets of responses. What are 3 ways we worked well together? We got things done, we split work, we collaborated. What problems? Nothing. What could you do more? Talk more. Cool. Okay. Not sure that the student had the reflection learning experience we wanted. So in contrast, so what we did was we gave students the same initial prompt. What are 3 ways you worked well together during last week's lab session? So the student says, we prioritize constant communication, took time to clarify roles at the beginning, so everyone knew exactly what to focus on. Now, the prompt sees that response and generates a new response, a new question and response. That's great to hear that you prioritize communication. Could you elaborate on how clarifying roles at the beginning impacted your team's performance? Well, each member knew exactly what they were responsible for, so I did notes, blah, blah, blah. It allowed us to stay organized and complete the lab more smoothly with fewer interruptions. How did clarifying roles at the beginning of the lab help ensure individual accountability within the team? Which is this thing that they sort of talked about. With clear roles, each person was accountable for different parts, blah, 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 blah. So you can start to see, just by comparing the questions, right? So 3 questions asked in each case. The nature of the questions is very, very different that comes up. And they really sort of dug into, again, they're pulling words from the student's response to generate the prompt, the question. So we think that this is a possibility, and again, this is going to segue into my research path, where this piece, it really can be this responsive tutor where the questions that it asks are actually taking the information from the student's thinking and reasoning previously. And the goal is to get them mimicking one-on-one responsive tutoring. Now, a number of challenges with this, and the first one is that the prompt engineering is critical. And when we first ran this as a sort of pilot study, we learned very quickly that if you don't put guardrails on it, the chatbot can lead them astray. For example, my students started asking it what they should make for dinner and whether they should invest in Bitcoin. And then they complained to me that it was able to lead them astray. And I said, okay. So you do need to train it for good question asking. We also know that it can be biased, redundant, overwhelming for the students when it kind of keeps probing and they're like, dude, I'm done, stop, please. But again, when we are thinking about large, the whole goal of this is to do scale. And once you think about scale, then, for me, I have many TAs that are teaching my courses for me. I also have to train them to do good question asking and to do the same sort of good evaluation. And so, again, any concerns that we have, I think we should also sort of have about the status quo. Not me. Okay, so this is just sort of a flavor about the things that we've been playing with from a teaching standpoint. There are obviously a lot of potential advantages, efficiencies, and opportunities for this kind of scale. Academic integrity concerns are still there, but I also, again, don't think that those are unique to GenAI. So students have always been, Googling things, finding solutions, copying from friends for any of the sort of homework assignments that we've had. If I can be a little bit provocative, it's possible that that kind of short-circuiting, shortcuts are now just actually more accessible to more students, and maybe it's actually an equalizer in some weird world is potentially a way to think of it. Anyway, just to get you. But ultimately, I think the whole piece of this is that it really does require us to ultimately rethink our learning goals. And I think science education has been pushing on this for a very, very long time. And to me, it feels like the moment is here desperately, more than ever, that thinking about sort of this critical thinking aspect. What does it mean to make claims and build evidence and all of that kind of stuff is paramount compared to the sort of, knowledge is available. We don't really need to focus on the knowledge as opposed to how we generate knowledge, how we evaluate knowledge, all of that stuff. Yes?
Could you elaborate a little more? You mentioned it briefly on, I think, when you were talking about the assignment you gave that had them using a chatbot. For students that have an ethical concern about using AI or an environmental concern, I think you said that you generated the sort of responses for them once, and then they just had to reflect on that. Is there, what are the other ways that you can think of it, because that worked for that particular assignment, but how do you handle that, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, so the reflection is another example, right, where we sort of force the students to engage with the chatbot. So in that case, we had an option of sort of, if you don't want to engage with the chatbot, here are the static questions. And so in that case, it's just use the predetermined static questions that we had before, and you don't need to go in that case. That was one option.
Small question with that. How many of your students opted for that?
I haven't actually checked recently. No, I don't know. I will check. I think I can check. It's wrapped up into the consent information, so I actually may not be able to check. This is always this like, anyway, ethical commitment, yeah.
I'm curious on how you disseminated your trained chatbot to your class, right? Did you, yeah, so.
For the reading
For the,
or the reflection?
for the reflection, like there's this beautiful, there's all, put the guardrails to all the
Yes.
things, and now they're not gonna tell students about Bitcoin or all the things, but that means they all have to use that same.
Yes. So for that study in particular, because it was tied up in a research program that we'll get to in a second, Alex Worth was actually able to integrate it into Qualtrics. And so we ran it basically as a survey, so the students actually were randomly assigned, we'll get there, to either interact with the bot or to answer the static questions. And so it was beautifully integrated into us.
So the bot was within
It was within Qualtrics. Don't ask me how she does that, I don't know. Again, I don't know what I'm talking about, but Alex does. And so I think there's other folks, there are several examples of reflection tutors, some proprietary, some open source. And so ultimately, once this gets published, we'll be planning to get ours open and available to folks. We're now playing with, can we get it to, what would the prompt look like for having students reflect on teamwork? We're looking at critical thinking, we're looking at lab skills, we're like trying to see if this is adaptable to different contexts right now. So we're hoping that that will all get it. Yeah.
Since we're on reflection, I
Yeah.
was curious about, I guess the goal is really just to have them reflect.
Yes.
That's great, but if it's for you to be able to process what they're reflecting on, it seems like it could really go in a million different ways.
Yeah.
Then do you have like a summary?
Yeah, let's go.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so now we're moving into taking my instructor hat off, putting my researcher hat on. The thread of sort of the research questions that we've been digging into when it comes to Gen AI is about this sort of evaluating how can we use it as a teaching tool and this sort of about comparing it to other methods, and then how do we use it and LLMs in general to analyze students' written material for a research purpose. And then there's sort of this through line of thinking about the environmental, ethical, moral, et cetera, responsibilities in all of these various contexts. So thinking about the teaching tool, so we'll go into the reflection piece in particular, right? So we did this controlled study where students were randomly assigned to either interact with the bot or to just answer these static questions, ultimately with the goal of evaluating the quality of students' reflections and subsequent learning outcomes. Again, sort of back to this piece of not just are they reflecting well, but is the reflection productive for a variety of student outcomes, and does the bot reflection improve those student outcomes? The first set of results that Alex and the grad student, Kevin Guru, did was that they actually evaluated the questions that were generated to understand what is it doing in this generation and how does that actually work. And the outrageous thing that they did was they eventually had the bot that they had, this prompt that they had trained, to then interact with another bot, and then they basically had two bots talking to each other, and they generated thousands of these conversations so that they could understand how it generates questions. It's very odd, but and so right now this is unfortunately just sort of very preliminary flavors of what they've been doing. Looking at sort of the sentiment analysis of what are the questions that it generates. So we know again, so this is they're very positive and not negative. So this is again towards this piece of the bots tend to be very agreeable and aligned with whatever the person is saying. A reasonable number of neutral conversations. Interestingly, a lot of very compound sentiments within their text, and we start to see here now that there's an interesting, it talks to bots differently than it talks to humans, which I think is really interesting, and the next slide I think says that a little bit more differently. So here we have the cosine similarity, so this is how similar is the text that the question that it generates compared to the response that it just got. So again, it's sort of trying to track this piece of how well is it picking up on what the response was in generating the next question. And so we see it's very high, but there's this interesting longer tail with the humans as compared to when it's talking to its own bot. So basically what this tells me is that bots can talk to bots better than they can talk to humans or pick up on the meaning of the humans. Unclear what that means. But, and then the last one, which I think again is really interesting, is the character count. So just the length of the questions that it generates when talking to another bot versus talking to a human. For some reason, they get really lengthy when they start talking to each other. And I think that this probably has to do with the responses that it's getting and this cosine similarity piece, et cetera, et cetera. So again, just sort of starting to get up on these guardrails and understanding the structure and the ways that it's asking questions. Obviously, there's a lot more to do in this space, which gets me into the next thing that we really want to do is analyzing the text and especially the sort of impacts the quality of the students' reflections. This is the piece that we're most interested in. The issue is that we ran this, the whole goal of running these sorts of things is, again, to be able to do it at scale. And so we ran this with over 1,000 students just in our intro physics class, as well as in a number of engineering classes. They have 3 reflection seeds, 4 questions per reflection. You can start to do that math. It's a lot of responses that we need to try to sift through, which basically means we need machine learning, or many human coders to actually analyze it, which is going to get us into the next piece. Yeah.
Okay, so 2 questions.
Yeah,
One,
so many
I'm not super familiar at all on those the previous graphs that you're showing, so I'm just trying to see if I understand fully what you were showing us. But what I'm trying to, I think it's more what's on this slide is like, I'm trying to understand. You would expect that there would be themes in these interactions, and it would just be like, things were good, things were bad, things were hard, like very distinct categories. Is that what you're saying?
That's going to be the next one.
For.
Yeah.
And is there a way for the bot to talk to the bot to then just sort of get a summary of those things? Okay, great.
Yes.
Cool.
But.
Yes.
So anyone who is not familiar with the process of qualitative coding of written text, let me give you my digested summary of like ultimately what we want to do. So these are the responses, the reflection responses that I showed you earlier. And I've highlighted here like what I would think of as themes. And so if I was a researcher coding this, as we call it, I would go through and write out like, okay, this person talks about a separation of tasks. Okay, so that's going to be a theme that I think comes up there that now I can't read. They also talk about efficiency, and that comes up here and here and here and here. So I would like get these markers for efficiency. They also talk about some social things. They talk about technical limitations. I guess social dynamics should probably be the same color as that, etc. So we would sort of go through this written text and like highlight these themes and these ideas to try to get the essence of what it is that the students are writing. As a quantitative researcher, what I would then do is count them. And so for each document, I might say, okay, how many times did the idea of role separation come up? How many times did efficiency come up? Et cetera, et cetera. And then ultimately, I would do this for a whole bunch of different documents and eventually add up what percentage of the documents talked about role separation, blah, 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 or maybe it would be the percent of total sentences. There's many different ways to quantify it. But this is the essence of what we're trying to do, and now we're trying to see if the AI can do this for us. And then ultimately what we're going to do is create some plot that says, okay, for each of the codes, this one came up this percent of the time, this percent of the time, this percent of the time, and this percent of the time. And I'm going to start using this label of EC and EH to mean this is the estimate, the estimated number of times that the computer estimated versus a human estimated. And this will come back up. Okay, so the question of can Gen AI or machine learning algorithms in general analyze written text as well as humans? And the answer to this is effectively yes, and I'm not going to go into the details because to me the interesting piece is about the when and how do we know and all of that stuff. And that's the research project that I'm going to talk about a little bit. And this is work that was particularly read by my former grad student, Rebecca Mussel, who really wanted to understand the, like, how do we learn to trust the output? Because we know that we can effectively engineer a system to do this as long as we are checking, but then once we have the trained thing, how do we know that we can then just go and use it on all kinds of different data from all kinds of different places? So comparisons to human-coded data is effectively going to defeat the purpose of using it, so we want to be able to use it without humans having to check the output every time. So what does it mean to actually make trustworthy claims about the output? So for this, one of the things that we did was actually sort of steal from the ways that we would quantify trust in science to think about statistical and systematic uncertainties. And so this is where I bring in my very little particle physics training and thinking about this. And so one of the pieces is we know that these models have probabilistic elements depending on your machine learning of choice. It might be in the training data, tuning parameters, initialization conditions, the actual model that you're using, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so luckily, we know how to deal with probability and statistics pretty well. And so you can actually just use statistical uncertainty ideas from repeated measurements. In this case, if you, for example, just repeat the machine coding on the same sample or on subsamples of your full data set, you should be able to determine means and then standard deviations on those means. You can even then just go through binomial statistics, and again, this parameter, right, the estimated number of times that the thing comes up, you can effectively use to calculate the standard deviation on that variability. So this is a piece that we sort of advise that everyone should be reporting generally in their outputs is some measure of statistical uncertainty on any of these outputs. We can put error bars on all of those graphs just based on what we know about statistics. That's okay, good. But we also realize that we think that there's a way to think about systematics, right? Because there are some interesting sort of ways in which these things behave systematically. And in particular, if a code, so a type of behavior, is very common or very rare in the data set, the machines we found tend to either overestimate or underestimate accordingly. So in this case, what this is representing is going to be the difference between how many times the computer says that this exists in your corpus of data versus how many times the human says that it exists in the corpus of data. And so if the thing is, so positive means the computer overestimated, negative means the computer underestimated, and we find that in general, what we'll find is that if it's very rare in the data set, it will overestimate, and if it's very common in the data set, it will actually underestimate. There's sort of some ceiling and floor effects there. And so we ran a whole bunch of data. We've got a gajillion graphs that look like this that effectively show this linear relationship of this over and underestimating. And so effectively what that means is that we can use these lines to then put systematic corrections on the estimate that it produces, again, sort of compared to what humans would say. So if this thing shows up 25% of the time in the data set, I would add some like 2% correction that's like, actually it's probably 2% lower than that because we think the computer overestimated. And so we've run these kinds of systematics graphs on a whole bunch of different codes and a whole bunch of different data sets, and we found that it's actually very robust to using this sort of line of best fit and literally just like, yeah, find the corresponding point on the line. And then the other thing that we learned is that we think it can also be used to correct for systematic bias between your data samples. So for example, this is a data set where we train a model to analyze data from one particular institution, and then we ran that same survey at 3 other institutions. And it did varying good jobs. So the black bubble is when we just sort of apply the model from the original training data. We find that it actually does a bad job at the other institutions of analyzing those ones. But from this data, from this sort of fit process, we can then find a new systematic correction and just sort of make these sorts of adjustments based on a relatively small amount of human coded data. Okay. So the correction for this is that you can't just sort of assume, you can't assume A, that one model will apply to all data from all places, and you also can't assume that a systematic, if you find this sort of systematic effect bias on one set of data, it may not apply in all cases, but we can always check. Okay, that was the most technical thing I'm going to say. The last way that we've been sort of evaluating this trust is the randomness that exists within different models. And so how much does it matter which model you're using when you use these tools? And so basically trying to understand, do the different algorithms come to the same conclusion? So what we did, first of all, was just ran a number of machine learning and large language models on coding a set of data. We ran it on 2 different codes. And so here we're just reporting the accuracy. So again, this is unfortunately compared to humans, the accuracy and the balanced accuracy for reasons. And we sort of see that there's a lot of variability here. They do a pretty good job in general. The x-axis effectively is moving towards more complicated, higher parameter models. And so higher parameter is not necessarily better which we thought was very interesting. And it also depended on the code that we were looking for in the data, right? So if your coding scheme is complicated and, well, anyway, it varies by we think that the machines are differently capable of coding depending on what you're asking it to look for. Despite that piece, what I thought was the more interesting outcome is, does it ultimately come to the same conclusions research-wise? So what I have here is a set of, so 3 different models comparing sort of the outcome that this EC, right? So how often would it say that this code existed in our corpus of data? Here we're looking across different lab sessions. So this is looking at student lab reports. And what does it say over time across the different lab sessions? Is it coming up with a consistent story? And so you should notice 2 things here. One is that the actual raw proportions between each of the models are very, very different, even when we take into account those systematic and statistical uncertainties. But the relative trends are the same, right? So this model is saying, like, relatively high the first 2 labs, big drop in lab 3, and then it sort of keeps going. All of them sort of have this same pattern, and ditto, this is the second code. And so the takeaway here is that I wouldn't really trust the values, the numbers that it produces, but I do trust the story that it, the ultimate claim that it's going to produce, right? So the trends here seem to be consistent. Okay, so in terms of efficacy of GenAI for replicating human analysis of written text, it does seem like it is very much at our disposal, a tool that we can use, but we do have to build these mechanisms for reporting and understanding our confidence, our trust, our uncertainty in the output that comes from it. So reporting uncertainties, comparing the outcomes of different models to check whether the claims are consistent. Again, I think we should also just be doing this regardless of AI in any sort of human code. Okay, I am taking a look at the clock, and I wonder how quickly I can get through the next thing. I'm going to try to get through this in 5 minutes. The last piece that I want to talk about is the cautionary tale of, like, does this mean that we should use generative AI for everything now? And obviously the answer to that is going to be no, but I want to provide a little bit of an anecdote about what that might look like. And in particular, I think the place that science education is thinking about a lot is, can we replace multiple choice tests with these kinds of open response things that then just get automatically coded by generative AI? And on the one hand, I think yes, but hold on. So we just finished a study where we wanted to compare, sort of reopen the question of what is it that we learn from an open response question compared to a multiple choice question. And so we have this assessment that we've been using for another project that uses a survey called the Physics Measurement Questionnaire that asks students about their thinking about uncertainty and measurement in the context of this projectile motion experiment. So they're given this context of a ball rolls down a ramp and then projectiles off, and students measure the distance from the table where it lands. There's 2 questions that we're going to look at. The first one reports 2 different groups of students reporting their data, and in these cases the data have the same mean and different spread. So the question is called same mean, different spread, SMDS. And then ask them, which group do you think, which group's measurements do you think are better, A, B, or the same? And then the second question is called different mean, same spread, where the students' reported measurements have different means, slightly, but the same sort of variability and spread in the measurements. And so in this case, they ask, do the results of these 2 groups' measurements agree? And then in both cases, they're asked to explain their reasoning. And so this was an assessment that was developed in the 90s, I think. It has historically always been an open response assessment. It's one that we love in physics education, but everyone hates coding the open response questions. And so what we did was we tried to figure out, could we move this to a closed response question, and would it be as effective as the open response question? So the open response is, please explain your choice. We'd run this a number of times. We had a corpus of student responses to pull from. We generated a bunch of closed response questions or items in response, and so the closed response version is, please choose 1 or 2 of the following statements that are most relevant to your reasoning for choosing A or B or yes or no. Okay, so we gave this to a whole bunch of students. We randomly assigned them into groups where they either got the open response question followed by the closed response question, or just the closed response question. And so with each of the two groups, we sort of did this crossover design. And so first of all, we just wanted to know, does posing an open response question followed by a multiple choice response question change their answering on the closed response question? So in that case, we compared the group 1 versus group 2 responses on the closed response, and the answer to that is no, it has no effect. They still choose effectively the same things, which is interesting. But the one that I'm going to talk about instead is, do we measure students' reasoning differently on the open response question compared to the closed response question? So this is just going to be comparing within each group, what do they say, what do they generate on their open response, versus what do they select on the closed response question. And so just in general, one of the things that I think is interesting is that on the open response question, the students generate fewer ideas than they will select on the multiple choice option. So they would generate, on average, 1.2 ideas that we would code, but they more often selected 2 on the closed response question, which has implications for what it is that we're measuring. What does this actually look like? So then we drill down into these questions. So what I'm going to show you is the percentage of students in each of the groups that selected or generated a variety of reasoning items. So for the SMDS question, again, the question was, which group's measurements do you think are better and why? The 2 most common ones that come up are group A's range is smaller than group B's range, and the second one is that the spread of their measurements, i.e. the standard deviation, is smaller than group B's. And so on the open response question, I apologize, anyway. On the open response question, most students said something like this A4, this idea of the spread. And almost everyone separates that idea. But on the closed response question, we see something very different, right? Where almost all of those students selected that item, but then they also selected the additional item of looking at the range. And so the way that we think about this is that on the closed response item, the students are selecting ideas that are sort of congruent with the idea that they initially wrote down, but is sort of articulated in a slightly different way. And then on the second question, the reasoning items in this case are about, do the measurements agree? And it's about comparing the difference between the sets of measurements and what they're comparing it relative to. So the more common one is on the open response is just saying the difference is small, but then the other ones they start to get into relative to what. So in this case, the ranges overlap, the percent difference is small, the difference is small compared to the spread of the data, or the difference is small compared to the size of the measurements. So in each of these cases, you can start to see that these are kind of the same idea, but described very differently. So in the open response item, most students are saying the differences are just small. A bunch of students sort of getting into small considering the spread, and then sort of some scattering on the other ones. But now on the closed response, we see some different stuff happening. So in particular, right, Y5 almost disappears. So the students stop selecting the thing that just says the difference is small in favor of small relative to something. We also coded a significant number of things as other, and the students don't pick other. They pick something else. And so what we think, and then I should have highlighted Y7 is the other one, right, where they have now, in all of these cases, they basically move from this sort of vague idea to something that is more specific, these other items. And so we interpret that to mean that the students are really selecting ideas that are more specific or articulate versions of the idea that they originally wrote down. So what does all of this have to do with AI? So should we replace multiple choice assessments with free response assessments? As I said, we're sort of reopening a question that I think has existed in the science education literature for a very long time. We are not the first people to make this point. But the answer to this question in my mind is not necessarily. I don't think the multiple choice question is necessarily dead. The 2 types of questions are measuring very different cognitive processes and have very different trade-offs. So in the example here, the closed response survey may have missed a whole bunch of information about the ideas that were most accessible to students, both sort of at the front of the mind, most accessible, and also most articulable. I don't know if I made that word up. On the other hand, the open response survey probably would have missed information about all of the various ideas that the students recognize as being correct, as well as may have misrepresented or failed to capture a significant number of students' reasoning, where they said one thing, but they actually meant another thing, and we would have missed that in an open response test. Okay, so I got through that. Anyway, we've got a little bit of time for questions. So once again, I think for education research, there are a lot of opportunities, advantages, efficiencies, et cetera. And the question that just keeps coming back into my mind is, how do we know if this is better or worse than the status quo? Is it better or worse? Probably sometimes. It's really messy, but it's also a lot of fun, and there's a lot of space to be learning and playing here. So with that, let me acknowledge my wonderful group and collaborators and all of the various funding that has supported this work over the last couple of years. And thank you again for coming, and hopefully you have some time for conversation.
We do, so unfortunately, the microphone, someone left it on and their battery is dying. So use your teacher voice and ask your question. Heather, you want to go?
Sure. Sorry, I'm asking all the questions. So just for some context, I'm a biologist. So I was really excited by this idea of reporting uncertainty. I know we do it in a lot of different ways in biology, and so I'm just curious, like, are people reporting uncertainty in AI education literature in general? Is the way that you presented it a very common way, or is this, like, you're proposing this? I'm just very curious about your uncertainty question.
Anyone else want to answer that? I think it is very variable.
Okay.
You know, on the one hand, well, yes, I think I would say it is very variable. Certainly, I don't think I have seen many papers that look at systematics in education, that look at quantifying systematics in education. I don't think I have seen many of those, at least in the physical education research space. And I'm looking at anyone who's like, yeah or no.
I would add, Heather, so as a co-editor of Science Education, I have not yet seen, at least that's come to me, I've not yet seen a paper that even acknowledges that there might be uncertainty in the AI system.
Okay. So in that
right,
paper,
which is super frustrating.
that paper's coming out soon, did you say?
The uncertainty one is out. That was
It's out, okay.
Yeah, it's in the physical review of physics education.
Great.
Good also people to say.
Thank you. Cool. Yeah, I think that there are a lot of ways that people have, and I should also say, right, like there's a whole world of like computer science folks who are probably doing this but every time that when Rebecca and I were working on this paper, I was like, surely someone's already done this, and she's like, I can't find it. So I'm sure it exists somewhere, but it has not been a critical conversation in the ways that we've been. Maybe someone knows of other things, they're like, go see this paper. Yeah.
So thank you, that was very interesting. It was wonderful to see what we're learning about the consequences or the pros and cons of using AI, especially for the coding stuff you did most recently. I thought that was, you spoke about it, really interesting. But I'm curious what this research might tell us about student learning.
Right.
So what would you say to that? Because I feel like it's definitely unpacking some things that we sort of assume, but they're sort of like big complex ideas, and I feel like we might be getting at some nuances that we haven't really unearthed in quite the same way before. Can you talk about that?
Student learning about.
Well, so for example, when you have those, you went from the like generalized prompts to the more personalized prompts. I mean, we all know, depending on what learning theories you follow, that like, you know, zone of proximal development. Like if you provide something that's a little bit of a stretch for someone's cognitive abilities, that they couldn't necessarily do on their own, and you can use prompts or more personalized responses to get at that, you're going to actually help them advance their learning. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Are there other ideas or reflections you have about learning that might be coming, either reinforcing what we already know or taking it in kind of new directions? And it's kind of a trick question, so.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think that the possibilities are endless, and I think that it can do any of those things, and it should be able to take any of our learning theories and implement them at the scale. And the question is on, I'm choosing the word should be able to, right, very carefully, because I think that's where, again, the guardrails are so important, and like, how do you teach it years of education theory to actually do that properly, right? And so that's the piece that's, I think that there's going to be a huge variability in efficacy, but in theory, There is also a huge variability in the quality of any of our teachers and trainers in all kinds of contexts. And so I think that there's this piece of scale and all of that stuff. Is it going to replace people in classrooms anytime soon? No, I don't think so. But I think it does give us the opportunity to do different things, because I think there's some stuff that it can replace and some stuff that it never will, and so we can let it replace the stuff that it can replace and allow us to spend our time in classrooms doing even more interesting and exciting stuff. That's a good question, right?
I might have missed this because I walked in a little late, but how were your student responses collected? What, like, I'm just, like, was it all, or were your students all, like, on computers? Is it cell phones? Is the technology of choice that they're using to interact with the system limiting their response length and context?
Oh, probably. We did not check. That's very interesting. I think we can check on one of the survey systems where we integrated it. Are they using a phone or a desktop? It's a really good question.
I just know that the amount of writing papers on like phones or doing homework on phones is on the rise, and so I would
it's
see
wild.
your response would be shorter if you're using just your
It
phone.
would be shorter for using phones. Yes. I don't know, but that is checkable in a lot of contexts. Yeah.
You sort of have answered, because I was going to ask, like, you know, if you see AI as something that can effectively read and reply to student responses, then is there a future where the educator is entirely removed from the classroom? And you're saying no. What are the situations in which, like, what are the human elements you see as irreplaceable?
So one of the pieces, which goes back to my very first slide, I studied student learning in hands-on lab courses. And that's one of the things that is in my mind. A physical experiment is not replaceable. And we can talk about what simulations can and can't do. But the process of doing a physical hands-on experiment, and then in biology or going out into the world and like actually doing the thing, field courses, all of that kind of stuff, I think is irreplaceable. And so I think it's this piece of scientific reasoning, critical thinking, engagement in the actual scientific practices is the stuff that's going to be irreplaceable, and having a guide there who is responding to the experimental scenario and the data that you're getting and all that kind of stuff, I think is ultimately, is probably mostly irreplaceable. Checking my words before they come out.
Do you think there are like some classes which could be? Or would
I think there are some learning goals that can be removed. That's the piece. I think that there is some aspect, and I think that those learning goals have already been replaced by other forms of technology that have come out in the last several years, right? I don't think that it's classes, I don't think that it's, but I do think that it's learning goals, right? I don't know, going back to like an old school Bloom's taxonomy thing, right? Like, let's finally get rid of those base level things, get those out of the classroom time, and let's actually focus on the top of that pyramid, is sort of how I see it. And I know that's very old school learning theory, well, not even theory, but.
Yeah. Janice, you got it.
Yeah, I have a follow-up to that, but I don't know how to word it.
Great.
So I'm just going to do stream of thought.
Perfect.
Build it as you want.
That's what this whole talk was, so see, it's right me in that.
Is, what I'm thinking of is the follow-up to like, are educators replaceable? I agree, no. In part because what,
as you said, I realize I have a different answer to that question now.
is that when you presented a very elegant development of a chat box within a system with very clear guidelines and guardrails of effectively teaching the students how to learn, right? And so I guess my question is, do we think if classrooms are going to be, or educators, or human educators are going to be replaced in a traditional setting by not hands-on learning type of stuff, would that then mean that students would be able to use open source without guardrails? Right? I mean, because basically, like, we're
Like, do,
right,
so,
so
like,
if
do teachers just become the prompt engineers, right? Like, are they the ones who end up having to craft?
Right, I mean, I guess is the fear that students are going to be mature and self-reflective enough to be able to use an open source without guardrails
Oh, yeah.
to then teach themselves, right? I mean,
No, I think to me, the idea would be that educators become the people designing these incredibly robust chatbots that can then replicate what they would have done in the classroom, and the idea that then you can just do it at scale. So as you were talking, that I realized that I actually have a different answer to that, that, you know, well, no, maybe it's the same answer, right? That like the learning goals also have to change, and like the social, cultural, emotional, affective pieces end up being paramount. Like I think that there are some low-level cognitive tasks that AI can replace, but all of that other stuff, right? And not just cognitive outcomes, but all of the other affective, emotional, social, et cetera, epistemological, philosophical, like all of that stuff becomes so paramount. And I think that's the other piece that like, we move teaching to focus on all of that stuff, right? I don't think we should put students in front of a computer for 8 hours a day and have them not talk to people. Like, I just think that there's something
Yeah, you better
this is where like the humanities is going.
You better tell some people who are making those AI charts. I mean, my snarky way of saying it might be that, when I work with like new STEM teachers is, do you think that your job is to, or do your students in your classroom think that they're playing a game?
Right.
Or they're trying to win a game, AI included or whatever, or are you creating a community of learners, right? And maybe, I don't know. Let's thank Natasha for